So in this chapter, we start this distinction between abiotic and biotic resources. So here in chapter 5, we're going to look at the abiotic resources, and then in chapter 6, we'll look at the biotic resources. So I guess, kind of the key thing here would be what's the difference between the two, an abiotic versus a biotic resource. When we're talking about abiotic resources, we're talking about these non-living components within the environment. Fossil fuels, minerals, water, land, solar, right? None of these things are alive. So how do we, understand those resources within the environment? The biotic resources can have both can be both stock flow and fund service, whereas the abiotic resources can be either non-renewable or renewable, or we'll call them virtually indestructible. The second bullet point is the thing that is kind of debatable, right? I say it's debatable because obviously there's a segment of the population that believes that human activities don't affect the renewable capacity of biotic resources, whereas many scientists, and when they think of things like global warming and whatnot, believe that human activities can affect the renewable capacity of biotic resources. So let's just say, at least for the moment, that the second bullet point can be debatable. Not that I'm debating it, but I'm trying to recognize the fact that, one, I'm not a professionally trained scientist, so my ability to use my professional expertise to dispute the second bullet point, or to state unequivocally the second bullet point is true. I don't have that scientific training. And I at least want to carve out a space for the fact that I don't know everything. And maybe even those who I disagree with may know something that I don't know. I don't think that's true, but I at least don't want to allow it to be the case. Okay, so let's talk about these fossil fuels and minerals. Again, we've already talked about these laws of thermodynamics and whatnot. But what we know about these fossil fuels and minerals is that they are incredibly important. And they became incredibly important starting in the 18th century, starting in the 1700s, namely coal, right? And then in the 19th century, 1800s, we turned to oil. And then in the 20th century, we vastly expanded our use of coal and oil as these fossil fuels. To extract the energy from those fossil fuels to be able to power the economy and to be able to power human existence. And so what are we doing there? We are using energy that's basically stored in those fossil fuels and turning it into something else, right? We're transforming those fossil fuels into something useful. And the important point here, the thing that's happening here is that in that conversion process, some energy is lost, right? That's part of the law of thermodynamics. But that what we also look at is that return on investment. How much of energy are we obtaining from that resource? How much energy is it requiring to obtain that energy, right? And as we use more and more of that resource, what we typically tend to find is that we use more and more energy to derive that energy. This isn't an old topic. This actually started to become a thing that we talked about with what's called the Hubbards Peak. And the Hubbards Peak was this idea that when Hubbard King came up with this, was that there was this idea that a stock flow resource like oil tends to follow a bell-shaped curve, where production starts slowly, then rises as the extraction becomes more efficient, and then declines as that resource becomes scarcer and it becomes more difficult to extract that resource. And that what Hubbard said is that time and time again, that this bell-shaped curve, this peak point, has been seen time and time again with these stock float resources, and that he saw this with US oil, and that his belief was that around 1970, that peak oil production had been achieved. And I think he was writing this in like 1974, 1975. And so that what he then said was that we need to recognize that the peak of oil production has occurred, and we now need to start planning for use of oil in the future, and that we need to start conserving it. We need to start planning for our use of oil, and that we need to start developing alternatives to oil while we're still close to that peak point in the oil extraction. Now, part of the problem with Hubbard's peak, which turned out not to be true, part of the problem is that there's a great deal of uncertainty about what that reserve is. That with any fossil fuel or non-renewable resource, what tends to happen is that, right, we get geologists, we get others kind of make estimates of what we think that the resources are. And what they will typically do is create three possible scenarios. Is that we have proven reserves, probable reserves, and possible reserves, which all have varying levels of probability of existing. And that there's the things that we absolutely know to be true underground. I shouldn't say absolutely know to be true, but highly, highly, highly likely know to be true. That would be about 90% probability of what we think we can extract. And then there's the probable, which has a smaller probability, and then the possible, which has an even smaller probability. And what we see is that things are changing. What are the things that are changing? What's changing is both our technology of extraction, but also our technology of knowing. Just in the previous chapter, I talked about a new technology that developed for oil and a new technology that developed for rare earth extraction. And that those two changes is that in oil, we basically developed new technologies for fracking, which is this way of extracting resources, oil, in a way where you're drilling at angles and you're then infusing sand into wells to further extract oil. And that the other resource or technology change that we had was enhanced ways of exploring underwater, which allows us to then extract these rare earth metals that exist in underwater nodules, which now expands out in both cases what we think the reserves are for those fossil fuels. And that only emerges in some part because of changing technology, but what drives the development of those technologies are different prices. Right? These are all market actors at some point. And so those enhanced prices push scientists and push investors to invest more and to do more. And so one of the things that we see here, especially today where we're in this point of transition from non-renewable to renewable resources, is that our given reserves, what we think are our given reserves, is first not completely knowable, but that what we think are our reserves are expanded by changing prices. What we see around us, for instance, with things like oil, is that yes, we use a lot, but we've become more efficient in our use of it, especially in the past 20 years. As we think about, like, for instance, when we think about private automobiles, right, the cars that you and I all own have become more efficient just as policies have changed, that vehicles now have to achieve certain levels of efficiency that, we see. One second. Sorry about that. So in this, transition from non-renewable to renewable resources, typically what we're doing is we're looking at, again, where we think we are on Hubbard's peak and what those prices are for those relevant resources. And as things become scarcer, as those fossil fuels become scarcer and drive up the price, what it typically does is pushes investments into the renewable energies. And that's sort of the era that we live in right now. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, we're in the midst of a transition from cars running on purely gasoline to not being run on gasoline, right? I mean, shop for a car today, and it's pretty difficult to just find a straight gasoline engine with no sort of hybrid or, hybrid technology or running on an alternative fuel. The car makers aren't making those kinds of cars as much, and the financial incentive to buying a pure gasoline powered car, they're just more expensive. So the only kind of debates that we see out there are some manufacturers, such as Toyota, not investing a great deal in electric cars, but instead really focusing on hybrid cars, which sort of is a transition response to this world that we live in between gas to electric, right? So it uses both gas and a smaller battery to aid the engine and to reduce the use of gasoline. And then you've got, obviously like the Teslas out there, which run entirely on electric, right, and don't have any gasoline options. And we see this point where the big auto manufacturers like GM and Ford and Volkswagen and whatnot go between these times of like either going all in and making all electric cars to then saying, oh, we're just going to do hybrid, to going back and forth. And it's the transition is messy. It really is. And we're not seeing this just in cars, but we're also seeing this in the generation of electricity. Fun fact, although it's not that fun, right now, in the middle of the day in the state of Texas, you actually would get paid to use electricity. And why is that? Because in Texas, the grid is set up so that it's not connected to other electrical grids, meaning basically electric generated in Texas stays in Texas. But in Texas, because they're generating so much electric now with solar. They used to generate it a lot with natural gas. Today it's mostly solar. But in Texas, it's pretty sunny, right? And so they're generating so much electric that it has nowhere to go. And so they literally will pay you to take electric off the grid in the middle of the day. And that's the problem that a lot of the US faces right now, is that a lot of both individuals and even utilities are expanding their use of solar generated power. but what they're finding is an inability to move around that electricity during the day and store it so that they can use it at night. Right? And so again, this transition is causing all sorts of problems because for the most part, we used to generate electricity by burning coal. And coal, for the most part, coal powered generating plants have been decommissioned for the most part. And we haven't built a new nuclear power plant. We did just open one not too long ago, I think in Georgia. Actually sat next to a guy on a plane who worked for a company that was doing it. It was really interesting to talk to, but it took decades to build that nuclear power plant. And before that, not one had been built since 3 Mile Island in 1979. So that meant that for the most part, the only transition, maybe about 15 years ago, was instead of using a coal plant, was to use a natural gas powered plant. And we had lots of natural gas because that was a byproduct of actually fracking oil. So, right, that's kind of an interesting kind of byproduct of that new technology. You should, by the way, I would encourage you, if you're interested in all this kind of discussion that we're having here, look up the well, let's not just say look it up, let's just show it to you. This is the Wikipedia entry for the Hubbard peak theory. And I was just kind of curious, the oil one was one I knew well, and that was the one that was in the slide. But what's interesting is it first talks about that transition to fracking, which went beyond what we expected. And you kind of see that right here. Look at this, right? Is that we thought we had reached that peak in 1970, and then look what happened. Again, about 15 years ago, we hit it again, right? Completely unexpected and in part just pushed by new technologies. But what's really interesting about this Wikipedia entry is that it then at the end, it actually does it for the other fossil fuels, which I found incredibly interesting because I actually didn't know very much about this. So we get it for natural gas, coal, which happened over 100 years ago, we hit the peak there. But even for uranium, helium, and other kinds of even kind of the precious metals and whatnot. So it's a very interesting expanded discussion, and then they do it for other abiotic resources. So I would really encourage you to read this Wikipedia entry. I could force you to read it, but I'm not going to do that. Okay, so what do we see with these mineral resources? Well, what we're doing here is, again, with these mineral resources, what we're doing here is that it's a bit more complicated because we're engaged in a process of extraction. And what that means is that we are doing a transformation process in that extraction. We're not destroying things in their use. We're instead engaged in this process called entropic dissipation. So what is entropic dissipation? That what we're seeing here is that as we extract more and more of these mineral resources, the quality of that resource is becoming degraded. So the quantity might not be changing, but the quality is. And you actually see that in that Hubbard peak Wikipedia entry, is that basically peak coal was in the 1920s. We still dig for coal. We still extract coal. It's just that the coal is of a lower quality. Same with uranium, same with these other resources. And so then again, the only thing we really can do to avoid this entropic dissipation is we'd have to find new sources. Right? Again, we don't typically extract mineral resources from under the sea, so we know that the quality of those nodules is incredibly high. And the other thing that we're seeing here is not only is the quality going down, but it's taking more resources to even extract these harder to obtain resources. So really the biggest thing that we can then do to kind of overcome this entropic dissipation is to recycle. We see that you know one of the amazing things about plastic bottles versus aluminum cans is that aluminum cans are highly recycled. Same with automobiles. The steel in those vehicles is highly recycled. I mean, look at it. You know, we make fun of like scrap yards and whatnot, and I actually drive an incredibly junky vehicle. But one of the things I'm always amazed by going to a junkyard is, in some sense, everything is being extracted and recycled and reused because there is profit to be made in it, right? I mean, as a person who loves Star Wars, I mean, these are the Jawas of the, you know, of the Star Wars universe, right? They're just taking all of these resources and they're reusing them. Not only for me as a consumer who's like looking for a part on a particular vehicle, but right, they're basically, you know, they've got scrappers out there that are just taking all the electrical wiring out of it, for instance, to recycle the copper, you know, taking all of these resources out and basically deconstructing the vehicle. And the other thing that's interesting that's being done is that the cards are even being constructed differently to make that recycling more usable. Aluminum cans, yes, highly recycled. Plastic bottles, it's getting there, but it's not anywhere near as high as it is for aluminum cans. Aluminum cans are a much more environmentally friendly container than plastic. And then we get these other kinds of resources, for instance, like water. Now, that we know is incredibly important because it's essential for life. But what we see is that it's both a stock flow as well as a fund service resource. By that we mean is that it, as a stock flow resource, we talk about that process where water can be stored in an aquifer to be extracted, for instance, by a municipal resource, you know, a municipal water company to extract that, you know, purified water once it's taken care of. And it's supplemented by and complemented by this natural hydrological cycle. And this would be this idea that it rains. It rains on, let's say, a mountain. The water then runs down that mountain, and in that process, you know, the water becomes purified, right? And that we also see that then the water, when it's on the ground, can be evaporated, right, as the sun heats it up, and it goes into the sky, and thus falls down again as rain, right? And we can kind of understand both that fund service with that cycle where the water is continually renewed. But then nature also has that stock flow resource where the water can be stored over time. And that gets us the fact that water is both a stock flow as well as a fund service resource, is that it gets us that variability in space and over time. And that we, especially for me, especially here in the state of Hawaii, I see, because we basically have, being in the tropics, we basically have a rainy season and a dry season. And basically what happens is that we have to manage the use of that resource in the dry season to carry us over to the rainy season. And then we have to worry about how much rain we get in the rainy season to make sure that we have enough to get us through those other time periods. And what we see is that we're not only talking about the amount of water, but we're also talking about the quality of that water. And what we're seeing is that both in the amount of the water, it's difficult to predict how much water we're going to get season to season, right? Unless you're like populating the sky and causing it to rain by putting silver into the air, which causes rain to fall. Basically, you don't know how much it's going to rain, so it's unreliable, and that you can get regions of the country where you get a low snowfall, for instance, um, in the mountains in California, right? That if you don't get enough snow in the winter, you're going to have a really bad spring and summer, right? And so you want lots of snow, right? And so then California has developed this pretty extensive system to bring the water from the mountains to the arid valley, right? Sacramento, Los Angeles, that valley that comes from the mountain. But it's not just the quantity of the water, but it's also the quality, and that comes from pollution, which largely comes from overuse of fertilizer. Yeah, we have industrial discharge and whatnot, but individual residents, overusing water, and then the runoff from an individual's lawn with all those fertilizers causes problems, right? Too much nitrogen in the water. And an agricultural runoff, right? You could have like pig farms, you could have even just general corn farms where you both have excrement, right? Basically pig shit, and overuse of fertilizer, causing all of these chemical imbalances in the water, which makes it either costly to treat the water to make it usable, or unusable for consumers to use. And so then the response to this is to try to think about other kinds of water that we can use. And so then you're talking about desalination projects, which are incredibly expensive, but to some extent can resolve some of our water issues. Land is another one of those where we can look at how productive the land is, especially for things like agriculture, but also for things like housing and whatnot. What we obviously know is that land is not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous, right? We certainly know, what do people say, right? In real estate, it's all about location, location, location. And that is true. But also we're looking at things like especially when we're talking about industry, we look talking about its location in terms of how it's connected to transportation networks, and whatnot for its value. But then we could also talk about it when it comes to agriculture. We could just look at the value of that land in terms of its natural resources and the ability of that land to the ability of that land to produce agriculture. That got us to that idea, especially for those of you who took environmental economics with me, where we talked about the work of David Ricardo, who had this, idea in some sense that, later led to Malthus, who had basically said that, the land was going to become less and less productive, and that we were going to reach a point where the human species would die off because it wouldn't be able to produce enough land, enough agriculture from the land that it had. In some sense, we still talk about this today, but we've also generated, with the help of science, ways to rejuvenate and refertilize the land as it's being used. Some of that, some of the problems that we saw were things like, the Dust Bowl and whatnot in the 1930s is a classic example of the land being overused as um, abiotic resource. And that again gets us to now the really exciting resource that we talk about of solar energy, where we're talking about the idea that it is non-rival. It is excludable though, because you have to have the money to be able to afford being able to get it. But again, the exciting thing about this resource is that it is virtually unlimited in size. And I say this as a person who, I mean, we put solar panels on, I put solar panels on my house, and right, I have a 6-person household, right? Me and my 5-person family, right? So 6 people total. I think I have 32 solar panels on top of my house, and I think I generate like twice as much electric as I need, right? So then it drives me, I wouldn't say it drives me to use more electric than I should, but I find that I'm not using it as efficiently, electric, as when I was paying for it more directly. And that can be part of a problem here, right? Is that we're now doing things as a society. For instance, we've got all these cryptocurrencies, we've got AI especially generating lots and lots of electric use that in some sense we're not recognizing because, as I just said, Texas has got so much electric it doesn't even know what to do with it all, right? So if you're going to start a crypto mining company, build it in Texas, I guess, right? Or where do other people do it? They go to former Soviet republics that have lots of electric from nuclear power plants that they don't use all the electric from anymore, like Ukraine. And so what do we see here in this discussion here, right? As we kind of review all these different abiotic resources, what we understand is that they're all these things I've just talked about, all of them are essential for economic growth. They're all being used, and what we find is that we hire these scientists that are all making these predictions about how much of them we're using. But what we see is that even the scientific predictions are complicated, and our use of these things are complicated. And it's even complicated more as we transition to renewable energy, right, which don't face these same limits as the non-renewable resources.